I woke up the morning of our flight to Santorini and my husband told me he forgot to book my ticket, even though I had paid for the entire trip with my own savings. And that single moment of standing there in our bedroom holding my empty suitcase while he avoided my eyes became the catalyst that changed everything about who I was for the next 12 months. My name is Elena. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a financial analyst at a consulting firm in downtown Chicago, a job I fought hard to get after putting myself through graduate school while working nights at a hotel reception desk. My husband Marcus and I had been married for 6 years when this happened, and until that April morning, I genuinely believed we were partners in every sense of the word, that the life we'd built together in our small but comfortable apartment in Lincoln Park was something we both valued equally. Marcus's sister Vanessa was getting married in Santorini, Greece, one of those destination weddings that cost more than some people make in half a year. And she'd announced it 8 months earlier, with custom-designed invitations that arrived in cream-colored boxes tied with silk ribbons. The entire family was going. Marcus's parents, who lived in a sprawling house in Lake Forest, his 2 brothers and their wives, his aunt and uncle from California, even distant cousins I'd only met once at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. It was going to be a week-long celebration, the kind of extravagant affair where every dinner was a production, and every sunset required a photographer. When Vanessa first told us about it, Marcus had turned to me with this hopeful expression and asked if we could afford it, and I'd done the mental calculations right there at his parents' dining room table, figuring out what I could save if I brought lunch to work every day and stopped buying books and maybe picked up some freelance consulting work on weekends. I'd told him yes, we could do it, because I knew how much family meant to him, and because despite everything, I loved Vanessa too. She'd always been kind to me in that slightly distant way that suggested she didn't quite understand why her successful older brother had married someone from my background, but kind nonetheless. Over the next several months, I transferred money bit by bit into our joint account, money I'd labeled in my personal budget as Santorini Fund, watching the number grow from nothing to nearly $8,000. I'd researched flights obsessively, compared hotel options, read reviews of restaurants and beach clubs, created a shared document with potential activities, and estimated costs for everything from the welcome dinner to the farewell brunch. Marcus had seemed grateful, had kissed my forehead one night while I was hunched over my laptop comparing Airbnb options, and told me I was amazing for organizing everything. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could help this channel grow by clicking that subscribe button. We're working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to this community we're building together. The plan was that we'd fly out on a Thursday afternoon in late April, arriving Friday morning in Athens before taking a short flight to Santorini, where we'd have 2 days to recover from jet lag before the wedding festivities officially began on Monday. I'd requested the time off from work 3 months in advance, had bought a new dress for the wedding ceremony, had even splurged on expensive sunscreen and a hat that wouldn't blow away in the Mediterranean wind. The Wednesday before our departure, I'd laid out everything on our bed to pack, arranging my clothes and toiletries and the small watercolor painting I'd commissioned from a local artist as a wedding gift for Vanessa and her fiancé Thomas, a landscape of the Chicago skyline at sunset that had taken the artist 6 weeks to complete. That Wednesday evening, Marcus came home late from his job at an architecture firm, looking distracted and tired. And when I asked him if he'd printed our boarding passes, he'd waved his hand dismissively and said he'd do it in the morning. I'd felt a small flutter of anxiety then, but pushed it down, telling myself that Marcus was an adult who'd traveled internationally before, who surely knew how to manage flight documents. I finished packing both our suitcases, double-checked our passports, set 3 alarms on my phone for the next morning. We went to bed around 11, and I'd lain awake for an hour, mentally running through our itinerary, feeling that mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes before any major trip. When my first alarm went off at 5 a.m, I'd gotten up immediately, showered, dressed in comfortable travel clothes, made coffee and toast. Marcus had moved more slowly, had spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, had checked his phone repeatedly while eating breakfast. At 6:15, With our Uber scheduled to arrive at 6:30 to take us to O'Hare Airport, I'd asked him again about the boarding passes, and that's when his face had done this thing, this slight collapse of expression that I'd seen before when he realized he'd forgotten something important. He'd pulled out his phone, had tapped at the screen for a few seconds, and then he'd looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and frustration and defensiveness all mixed together. He told me there was a problem with my ticket, that when he'd gone to check us in online, my name wasn't showing up in the reservation. I'd felt my stomach drop, had asked him what he meant, and he'd explained in this halting way that he must have forgotten to add me when he booked the flights, that he'd been so busy at work when he made the reservation back in January that he'd somehow only booked a ticket for himself. I'd stood there in our kitchen holding my coffee mug, the morning light coming through the window making everything look sharp and unreal. And I'd asked him how that was possible when I'd given him all the information, when I'd sent him a text message with my passport number and TSA pre-check details, when I'd confirmed with him multiple times that everything was set. He'd gotten defensive then, had said that obviously it was a mistake, that he hadn't done it on purpose, that these things happen when someone is juggling a demanding job and family obligations. I'd suggested we call the airline immediately, figure out if we could book me a last-minute ticket even if it cost more, and he'd made the call right there while I watched, pacing back and forth across our small kitchen floor. The customer service representative had apparently told him that the flight was completely booked, that there were no available seats in any class, that the next available flight to Athens wouldn't be until Saturday evening, which would mean I'd miss the first 2 days in Santorini, including a welcome beach party that Vanessa had planned. I'd felt something crack inside my chest, but I'd kept my voice steady when I asked about alternative routes, maybe through a different European city, maybe on a different airline. Marcus had spent another 15 minutes on the phone, but everything was either fully booked or so expensive that it would cost another $3,000 just for my ticket alone. Money we didn't have after I'd already depleted my savings for this trip. When he finally hung up, he'd looked at me with this expression that was probably meant to be apologetic, but mostly just looked annoyed. And he'd said that maybe I should just stay home, that it didn't make sense to spend that kind of money for me to arrive late and miss half the events anyway. Your subscription really helps channels like this one reach more people who connect with these stories. If you haven't already, please click subscribe and be part of our journey to 1,000 subscribers. I'd asked him what he meant about the hotel, and that's when he delivered the second blow, explaining that when he'd made the hotel reservation back in February, he'd also apparently only booked for one person, that he'd just realized this when he checked the confirmation email. He'd said the hotel was completely full because of the wedding and several other events happening that same week, that his mother had already tried calling to see if they could add a room, but everything was booked solid. I'd stood there processing this information, understanding that not only had he forgotten to book my flight, he'd also forgotten to include me in the hotel reservation, which meant that even if I found a way to get there, I'd have nowhere to stay. I'd asked him, in a voice that sounded strange and distant to my own ears, how he could have forgotten to include me in any of the planning when I was the one who had paid for everything, when I was the one who had organized every single detail, when I had literally handed him a complete itinerary with all the information he needed to make these bookings. He'd gotten more defensive, had raised his voice slightly, and said that I was making this into a bigger deal than it needed to be, that mistakes happen, that he'd been under a lot of stress at work and couldn't be expected to remember every little detail. I'd pointed out that my presence on our vacation wasn't a little detail, and he'd snapped back that I was being dramatic, that his family would understand, that Vanessa wouldn't even notice if I wasn't there because the wedding was going to be so chaotic anyway. That last sentence had hit me like a physical blow, the casual way he'd suggested that my absence wouldn't matter, that I was so peripheral to his family's life that no one would register I was missing from this major celebration. I'd set down my coffee mug very carefully on the counter, had taken a deep breath, and had told him fine, he should go without me, that I didn't want him to miss his sister's wedding because of a booking error. He'd looked relieved, had actually smiled and said I was being really understanding about this, that he'd make it up to me when he got back. Maybe we could take a weekend trip somewhere closer. Then he'd grabbed his suitcase, had called the Uber to come just for him, and had left our apartment while I stood in the kitchen still wearing my travel clothes, surrounded by my packed luggage and the carefully chosen wedding gift. After the door closed behind him, I'd sat down on our couch and just stared at the wall for almost an hour, trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of my brain kept trying to make excuses for him, kept suggesting that maybe it really was just an unfortunate series of mistakes, that people forget things when they're busy and stressed. But another part of me, a part that I'd been pushing down for months or maybe years, was screaming that this wasn't normal, that you don't accidentally exclude your wife from a family vacation she paid for, that there was something deeply wrong about the casual way he'd accepted my absence as if I were optional in his life. I'd spent that Thursday doing mundane things, unpacking my suitcase, returning the special sunscreen to the bathroom cabinet, wrapping the wedding gift back in tissue paper, and storing it in our closet. I'd gone through the motions of my day like I was watching myself from outside my body, making tea, checking work emails even though I was supposed to be on vacation, scrolling mindlessly through social media. Marcus had texted me from the airport, a brief message saying his flight was boarding and he'd call when he landed, with a heart emoji at the end like that somehow made everything okay. I hadn't responded. That evening I'd sat down with a notebook and pen, something I hadn't done since college when I used to journal regularly, and I'd started writing down everything I'd been feeling, not just about the Santorini situation but about my marriage in general. I wrote about how I always seemed to be the one organizing our life, keeping track of bills and appointments and family birthdays, how Marcus would forget my birthday but never his mother's, how he'd often make plans with his friends without checking if we had anything scheduled together. I wrote about how small I felt at his family gatherings, how they'd talk about their expensive renovations and luxury cars, while I calculated whether I could afford to replace my aging laptop, how Marcus never seemed to notice or care that I felt like an outsider in his world. I wrote about the financial imbalance in our relationship, how I made slightly less money than Marcus, but somehow always ended up paying for our joint expenses, how he'd spend money on expensive golf clubs and craft whiskey, but would question whether we could afford for me to take a yoga class. I wrote about how we'd talked about having children, but he kept saying we should wait until we were more financially stable, even though I was 34, and very aware that my fertility wasn't going to last forever, and how I suspected that what he really meant was that he didn't want the responsibility of parenthood to interfere with his lifestyle. By the time I finished writing, it was past midnight, and I'd filled almost 30 pages with observations and feelings I hadn't let myself fully acknowledge before. Please, take a moment to hit that subscribe button if this story is resonating with you. We're building a community here, and every subscription brings us closer to our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support really matters. Over the next few days, I'd maintained minimal contact with Marcus, responding to his texts with brief acknowledgments, declining his video call attempts by saying I was busy with work. The truth was, I didn't trust myself to talk to him yet, didn't know what would come out of my mouth if I had to look at his face on a screen while he enjoyed a Greek island vacation that I'd funded but been excluded from. He'd sent photos occasionally, pictures of turquoise water and white buildings and elaborate meals, images of his whole family gathered together on a restaurant terrace, everyone smiling and tanned and relaxed. In none of these photos did anyone look like they were bothered by my absence. No one held up a phone to include me virtually. No one sent a message saying they wished I was there. On the day of the wedding, I'd received exactly one text from Marcus, a photo of Vanessa in her wedding dress, with a caption saying she looked beautiful, and nothing else. No acknowledgement that maybe his wife should have been there to witness this moment. No expression of regret or apology. I'd looked at that photo for a long time, at Vanessa's radiant smile, at the stunning backdrop of Santorini's famous caldera, at the pure joy evident in every face in the background, and something inside me had shifted permanently. I'd realized that I couldn't go back to being the person who would accept this kind of treatment, who would make excuses for being forgotten and excluded, who would smile and say it was fine when it very clearly wasn't fine at all. That night, I'd done something I'd never seriously considered before, and started looking at apartments I could afford on just my salary. I'd scrolled through rental listings in different Chicago neighborhoods, calculating deposits and monthly costs, imagining what my life might look like if I didn't have to factor Marcus into every decision. I didn't make any immediate moves, didn't contact any landlords or start packing boxes, but I'd bookmarked several promising listings and created a separate email folder to organize the information. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating to even consider the possibility of living independently again, of having my own space where I wouldn't have to constantly accommodate someone else's needs and preferences. When Marcus returned the following week, he'd come home with a small bag of tourist gifts, a bottle of Santorini wine, some local honey, a cheap decorative plate painted with Greek scenes. He'd seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't more enthusiastic about these offerings, had acted hurt when I'd thanked him politely, but without warmth. He'd tried to show me hundreds of photos from the trip, narrating each one with stories about the food and the views and the funny things his nephews had done, seemingly oblivious to how painful it was for me to look at images of an experience I should have been part of. When I'd finally asked him directly if he'd explained to his family why I wasn't there, he'd gotten vague and uncomfortable, eventually admitting that he'd just said something came up with my work, and I couldn't make it after all. So he'd lied to his family rather than admit he'd forgotten to book my travel, had let them believe that I'd chosen work over his sister's wedding, had allowed them to possibly think I didn't care enough about the family to prioritize this important event. I'd felt a white-hot anger rise in my chest, but I'd swallowed it down, had simply nodded and said okay, and had watched him relax, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. That night we'd slept in the same bed, but I'd positioned myself as close to the edge as possible, lying awake listening to him breathe, feeling like I was sharing a room with a stranger. The following weeks had settled into an uncomfortable pattern where we went through the motions of being married while I quietly built an exit strategy. I'd started putting every spare dollar into a separate savings account that Marcus didn't have access to, one I'd opened years ago but rarely used. I'd begun working longer hours and taking on additional freelance projects, telling Marcus I was trying to rebuild the savings I'd spent on Santorini, which was technically true, but not the whole truth. I'd started going to therapy, something I'd considered for years but never prioritized, and my therapist had listened to my story with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to genuine concern. If you're invested in hearing how this journey unfolds, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and clicking that button helps us build this community together. Through therapy, I'd begun to see patterns in my relationship that I'd normalized over the years, ways that Marcus consistently prioritized his own needs and comfort over mine, how he'd trained me to expect so little that I was grateful for basic consideration. My therapist had introduced me to terms like emotional labor and mental load, concepts that helped me understand why I was always exhausted even though on paper Marcus and I split household chores fairly evenly. I'd realized that splitting chores meant nothing when I was the one who had to remember what needed to be done, make the grocery lists, schedule the appointments, keep track of everything that kept our life running smoothly. I'd started experimenting with doing less, with not reminding Marcus about things, and seeing what would happen. His mother's birthday had passed without him acknowledging it, until she'd called asking why she hadn't received a card, and he'd been genuinely shocked to realize he'd forgotten, had asked me why I hadn't reminded him. Our car insurance had nearly lapsed, because I didn't follow up on the renewal notice, and Marcus had been annoyed with me for not taking care of it even though the car was registered in his name. These small experiments had confirmed what I was beginning to understand, that Marcus had become dependent on me to manage not just my own life, but his as well. And he'd somehow come to view this as my job, rather than recognizing it as labor I'd been doing for free. By summer, I'd saved enough money to cover first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit on a modest one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood I'd always liked, but we'd never considered because Marcus thought it was too far from his office. I'd started slowly moving some of my belongings out of our apartment. Things Marcus wouldn't notice immediately, books and winter clothes and kitchen items I'd brought into the marriage. I'd stored these boxes in a friend's basement. This friend Sarah, who I'd known since graduate school, who'd listened to me talk through my decision over countless coffee meetings and had never once tried to talk me out of it or suggest I was overreacting. Marcus had noticed I was different, had commented that I seemed distant, had asked if I was upset about something. I'd been honest in a limited way, had told him I was still hurt about Santorini, and he'd gotten frustrated and said he didn't understand why I was still dwelling on something that happened months ago, that he'd apologized multiple times, even though I couldn't actually remember a single genuine apology, and that I needed to learn to let things go. This conversation had happened in early July, on a hot evening when our air conditioning wasn't working properly and we were both irritable from the heat, and I'd realized with sudden clarity that I was done, that I didn't want to spend another week trying to make this marriage work, with someone who couldn't even acknowledge the harm he'd caused. I'd signed the lease on my new apartment the following week, had arranged for movers to come on a Saturday, when Marcus would be at his regular golf outing with his college friends. I'd left him a letter explaining that I was leaving, that I needed space to figure out what I wanted from my life, that I'd be staying with Sarah temporarily and would be in touch about next steps. I hadn't framed it as a permanent separation, partly because I wasn't entirely sure myself what I wanted long-term, partly because I knew Marcus would react better to a temporary separation than to talk of divorce. The movers had been efficient and professional, and by the time Marcus came home that evening, more than half of my belongings were gone from our apartment, leaving obvious gaps where my furniture and decorations had been. He'd called me 17 times that night, had left voicemails ranging from confused to angry to pleading, had sent texts demanding I come home immediately so we could talk about this like adults. I'd responded only once, with a brief message saying I needed time and space, and I'd contact him when I was ready. Then I'd turned off my phone and had sat in my new empty apartment, surrounded by boxes, feeling lighter than I had in years despite the gravity of what I'd just done. Sarah had come over with pizza and wine, and we'd sat on the floor because I hadn't yet bought any furniture, and she'd told me she was proud of me for choosing myself. Words that had made me cry because I couldn't remember the last time someone had expressed pride in something I'd done. The next several weeks had been complicated and messy, full of difficult conversations and negotiations over shared belongings and finances. Marcus had alternated between trying to convince me to come back and punishing me for leaving, sometimes within the same conversation. He'd wanted to know if there was someone else. Couldn't seem to comprehend that I might leave simply because I was unhappy, because I wanted more than what our marriage offered. His family had gotten involved, with his mother calling to lecture me about the sanctity of marriage and how my generation gave up too easily, with Vanessa sending a long email about how her wedding had been so stressful that Marcus couldn't be blamed for making mistakes during that time, never acknowledging that her wedding had taken place before the Santorini trip even happened. Your support means so much to this channel. If you could take a second to subscribe, you'd be helping us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and grow this amazing community we're creating. I'd found myself having to defend my decision over and over, to explain to people who would never fully understand that it wasn't about the plane ticket or the hotel room. It was about what those forgotten bookings represented, the pattern they illustrated, the future they predicted. Some people got it, like Sarah and my therapist and a few colleagues who'd been through similar situations. Others thought I was being too harsh, that marriage requires forgiveness, that everyone makes mistakes. What these people didn't understand was that I'd been forgiving Marcus for years, that I'd been making excuses for him and accommodating him and shrinking myself to fit into his life, and that the Santorini incident hadn't created the problem, it had simply forced me to see what I'd been avoiding. Living alone for the first time in 6 years had been an adjustment, but mostly a positive one. I'd bought furniture slowly and deliberately, choosing pieces I actually liked rather than compromising with Marcus's preferences. I'd painted my bedroom a warm terracotta color that Marcus would have hated, had hung art that reflected my taste, had created a space that felt genuinely mine. I'd started cooking meals just for myself, elaborate dishes that took hours to prepare, because I enjoyed the process and not because I needed to feed anyone else. I'd developed a morning routine that included meditation and journaling, practices I'd let slip during my marriage because Marcus thought they were silly and indulgent. I'd also started dating again, casually at first, just coffee meetings with men I'd matched with on apps. then gradually more serious connections as I figured out what I actually wanted in a partner now that I had perspective on what I didn't want. The first time a date had asked me what I did for fun, and I'd realized I didn't have a good answer. That most of my hobbies and interests had been subsumed into Marcus's life and preferences. I'd felt this deep sadness mixed with determination. I'd started taking a pottery class, something I'd been interested in since college but never pursued, and I'd discovered I had some actual talent for it. That working with clay was meditative and satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. By September, 5 months after the Santorini trip that never happened, I'd started to feel like myself again, or maybe like a version of myself I'd never fully been before. I'd lost weight without trying, probably from stress, but also because I was walking more and moving my body in ways that felt good, rather than exercising as a chore. I'd been promoted at work to a senior analyst position, partly because I'd been able to focus more energy on my career without the constant drain of managing a household and a husband. I'd reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage, people Marcus hadn't particularly liked or who hadn't fit into the couple-centric social life we'd developed. Marcus had continued to reach out periodically, sometimes angry, sometimes nostalgic, once showing up at my apartment building at 10 o'clock at night, demanding to talk, a scene that had resulted in me calling building security and nearly filing for a restraining order. His approach had shifted around October, when he'd apparently started seeing someone new, a junior architect at his firm who was 26 and from a wealthy family. Details I'd learned from a mutual friend who'd felt I should know. I'd felt a complicated mix of relief and vindication. Relief because maybe he'd finally stopped trying to convince me to come back. Vindication because it confirmed that he'd never really been committed to working on our relationship. He'd just been uncomfortable being alone. The divorce papers had been filed in November, almost exactly 7 months after that April morning when I'd been left behind. The process was relatively straightforward, since we didn't have children and had already divided most of our assets. Though there had been some dispute over money I'd spent on the Santorini trip, money Marcus argued was a gift, and I argued was a loan at minimum. Eventually, I'd let it go. Had decided that fighting over $8,000 wasn't worth the emotional energy, that I'd rather take the financial loss if it meant being free of him sooner. My lawyer had advised against this, but I'd been firm, understanding in a way I couldn't fully articulate that some things are worth more than money. Please click that subscribe button if you've been following along with this journey. Every subscription helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers and keeps this community growing strong. By the time my first Christmas alone rolled around, I'd been living independently for 5 months and felt more stable and content than I had in years. I'd spent the holiday with Sarah and her family, had felt welcomed and valued in a way I'd rarely experienced with Marcus's family. I'd bought myself gifts I actually wanted, had cooked a small feast just because I felt like it, had video called my parents in Arizona, and for the first time in years, hadn't had to divide my holiday between multiple family obligations. It had been quiet and peaceful and exactly what I needed. And when New Year's Eve arrived, I'd stayed home with a good book and a glass of wine, watching the neighborhood fireworks from my apartment window and feeling genuinely excited about what the new year might bring. The year that followed the Santorini incident became a year of rebuilding and discovering who I was outside of my marriage, outside of the role I'd been playing for so long. I'd learned that I actually liked living alone, that I was good company for myself, that I didn't need someone else to validate my existence or make me feel complete. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for, that I could handle difficult conversations and major life changes and financial stress without falling apart. I'd learned to trust my instincts again, to listen to that voice inside that tells you when something isn't right, the voice I'd been trained to ignore or explain away. Looking back now, more than a year after that April morning, I can see that being excluded from the Santorini trip was both the worst thing and the best thing that could have happened to my marriage. It was the worst thing because it exposed the fundamental lack of consideration and respect that had been present all along, because it made visible what I'd been pretending not to see. It was the best thing because it gave me a clear, undeniable example of how I was being treated. Something I couldn't rationalize away or make excuses for. Something that forced me to make a choice about the kind of life I wanted to live. I don't think Marcus ever fully understood why I left. Why that particular incident became the breaking point when I'd tolerated so much else over the years. In his mind, he made an honest mistake, and I overreacted, punished him disproportionately for a forgivable error. What he couldn't or wouldn't see was that it wasn't about the mistake itself, but about what the mistake revealed, about the pattern it was part of, about the casual way he'd accepted my absence from his family's major celebration, as if I were an optional accessory in his life, rather than his supposed partner. The hardest part of that year wasn't the logistics of separating our lives, though that was certainly challenging. It was facing the truth about how much of myself I'd given up trying to make the marriage work. How many times I'd prioritized Marcus's needs over my own. How thoroughly I'd internalized the message that my feelings and preferences were less important than maintaining peace and making things easy for him. It was recognizing that I'd become complicit in my own diminishment, that I'd trained him to treat me as dispensable by always being willing to accept less than I deserved. But the most powerful part of that year was discovering that I could build a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, that I didn't need to settle for a relationship where I was constantly anxious and diminished and exhausted from carrying the emotional weight of two people. I'd found that I could be happy on my own, that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing, that there was profound freedom in answering only to myself. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by whether someone chose to remember to book my plane ticket, that I could choose myself even when no one else was choosing me. If this story has moved you or made you think about your own life in new ways, please subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support helps keep this community thriving. By the spring following the Santorini incident, I'd started seeing someone new, a man named David who I'd met through my pottery class, someone who remembered details about my life without me having to remind him, who asked about my day and actually listened to the answer, who made plans that included me naturally and automatically, because he genuinely wanted me there. It was still early, and I wasn't rushing into anything, was being very careful about maintaining my independence and not falling back into old patterns. But it was showing me what a healthy relationship could look like, how different it felt to be with someone who treated me as an equal partner rather than as support staff for his life. I'd also started writing more, not just journaling but essays about my experience, pieces I'd submitted to a few online publications that focused on women's stories. One of these essays had been accepted and published, and the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of women commenting that they'd had similar experiences, that they recognized themselves in my story, that reading about my decision to leave had given them courage to examine their own relationships. It had been validating and also heartbreaking to realize how common this pattern was, how many women were living versions of my old life, making themselves smaller and smaller to accommodate partners who took their labor and love for granted. This realization had led me to start volunteering with a local organization that provided resources and support for women going through divorce, particularly women who'd been financially dependent on their spouses, or who'd lost their sense of self within their marriages. I'd lead a monthly support group, sharing my story and listening to theirs, offering practical advice about everything from opening separate bank accounts to finding affordable therapy to rebuilding social networks. It had given me a sense of purpose beyond my own healing, had helped me transform my painful experience into something that might benefit others. The divorce had been finalized in March, almost exactly a year after the Santorini trip, a timing that felt both coincidental and somehow appropriate. I'd felt an enormous sense of relief when the papers were signed, when the legal ties were finally severed, when I could introduce myself without having to explain my marital status in complicated ways. Marcus had married his new girlfriend in a small ceremony just 2 months later, something I'd learned about through social media, and I'd felt nothing but relief that he'd moved on so quickly, that I was truly free of him, on what would have been our 7th wedding anniversary. I'd taken myself out to dinner at an expensive restaurant I'd always wanted to try, had ordered exactly what I wanted without considering cost, or whether someone else would approve of my choices, had savored every bite while reading a novel I'd been saving for a special occasion. The server had asked if I was waiting for someone, and I'd said no. I was celebrating alone, and the look on his face had shifted from pity to something like admiration when I explained I was celebrating my divorce anniversary. He'd brought me a complimentary dessert and had said his sister had just left her husband, and he was proud of her bravery. And we'd had a brief conversation about how ending a marriage that isn't working is at least as worthy of celebration as starting one. That conversation had crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. This idea that we celebrate all the wrong milestones when it comes to relationships. We celebrate weddings and anniversaries, but we don't celebrate the courage it takes to leave, the strength required to start over, the wisdom involved in recognizing when something isn't working. We frame divorce as failure rather than as success, as giving up rather than as refusing to settle, as breaking something rather than as freeing yourself. I'd started to see my divorce not as the end of something but as the beginning, not as a loss, but as a gain, not as a failure, but as one of the most successful decisions I'd ever made. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference in building this community. As I moved further into my second year of living independently, I'd continued to discover new things about myself, interests and preferences I'd never had the space to explore during my marriage. I'd started traveling solo, taking weekend trips to places I wanted to see, not having to compromise on itineraries or worry about whether someone else was having a good time. I'd visited national parks and quirky small towns and cities where I didn't know anyone, had eaten alone in restaurants and gone to movies by myself, and learned that solo travel wasn't lonely, but rather deeply satisfying in ways that traveling with the wrong person could never be. I'd also invested in myself in ways I'd never felt I could during my marriage, taking courses and workshops in subjects that interested me, upgrading my professional wardrobe, getting the dental work I'd been putting off for years. These weren't extravagant purchases, but they felt significant because they represented choosing to invest in my own well-being and future, rather than always putting shared goals or Marcus's preferences first. I'd learned to value myself enough to spend money on things that improve my quality of life, to see self-care not as selfish but as essential. My relationship with my own family had improved dramatically as well, now that I didn't have to balance their needs with Marcus's family's expectations. I'd started visiting my parents more regularly, had developed a closer relationship with my younger brother, who I'd drifted apart from during my marriage. They'd all been supportive of my decision to leave, had admitted they'd never felt Marcus was right for me but hadn't wanted to interfere. And while part of me wished they'd said something sooner, I understood that this was a journey I'd needed to take myself. The most surprising development had been reconnecting with my grandmother, my mother's mother who lived in a retirement community in Florida, and who I'd barely spoken to in years. I'd called her one evening on impulse, needing to talk to someone who'd lived a long life and might have perspective on my situation, and we'd ended up talking for 2 hours. She'd told me about leaving her first husband in the 1960s, how scandalous it had been, how her own mother had stopped speaking to her for a year, how it had been the hardest and best.